Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. My name is Mikko Hyppönen. I am the Chief Research Officer for a company called F-Secure, which is a computer security company headquartered in Helsinki, Finland. And I am a Finn myself, and I've spent the last 26 years tracking hackers, trying to understand where the attacks are coming from and what the motivations of the various actors out there are. And when I say I'm trying to track them, I mean I'm really trying to track exactly who they are. Like, who are these people? What's their names? Where do they live? How much money are they making? We do quite a bit of infiltration work inside F-Secure to find our ways inside different organized online crime groups, to find our ways to their discussion forums, to find our ways to their forums where they buy and sell stolen goods. And I've seen many surprises over my career in computer security. I always carry something to remind me of where I'm coming from. One of the first viruses I ever analyzed. Some of you might remember these, the USB thumb drive of its time. And this is what the enemy used to look like. I mean, this is what the attacks used to look like. This is how simple it was in late 1980s, early 1990s. Malware was not spreading on the net, it was spreading on floppies that we were physically carrying on us. Yet, even those early viruses did become a global problem. So one of the surprises I've had during my career was first realizing that those happy hackers who were writing viruses for fun started to make money with their malware. The organized online crime groups started forming, which was something we were sort of forecasting, but it still surprised us how quickly it happened when it started happening in the early 2000s, around 2003 or 2004. But even then, I really didn't see the next big shift, which was governments entering this game. Governments starting to write malwares, governments starting to do offensive hacking. For years and years, it seemed like science fiction. But as we all know today, it is not science fiction. It is very real, and it is escalating. In fact, I do believe we are right now seeing the beginning of the next arms race. We just got out of the last arms race. We're no longer every day worried about nuclear annihilation like we were in the 70s and 80s. Of course, nuclear weapons still exist, but I believe the last arms race is behind us, and that lasted 60 years. And it might be that this is the next one, and this might last the next 60 years. But I do believe that we have no hope in trying to defend our networks if we don't understand who the hackers are. Many organizations, many individuals have a very cloudy view of who the hackers are. They think about these evil hackers who come from somewhere and do evil stuff for some reason, but they don't really think it through. And we have completely different kinds of groups, different kinds of actors targeting different targets for different purposes because they have different motivations. They use different techniques, which means you fight them with different technologies. So from my point of view, the crucial question really is, who are the hackers? And how are these actor groups changing as we go forward? So right now, today, I'm splitting hackers into 5 main groups. Let's see if this actually... So I'm splitting them into 5 main groups right now. And of course, this keeps on changing, but 5 main groups of hackers. First, here on the left, white hat hackers. This is Charlie Miller, this is Chris Valasek. They're both friends of mine, and they're both hackers. And you've heard of them, because these are the guys who hacked Chrysler Jeep vehicle systems in the summer of 2015, becoming front page news all over the world, because they were remotely over the internet able to take over passenger vehicles and drive them and accelerate them and disable the brakes and all kinds of scary things. But these are white hat hackers, so they didn't do that to drive people off the road. They didn't do that to steal people's money. They did that so they could tell Chrysler about the problems they found, so Chrysler could fix them. That's what white hat hackers do. And this is why companies run bug bounties, basically rewarding hackers with money when they find vulnerabilities in their systems. Google, Microsoft, and Apple are examples of companies which run bug bounties. We run a bug bounty. We actually invite hackers to try to break into our systems, and if they succeed, we pay them money. Why? Because when vulnerabilities are found from our systems, we want the hackers to tell us. We don't want them to tell someone else. In fact, we want them to sell that information to us. We don't want them to sell that information to someone else, potentially to our enemies. Group number 2, hacktivists or hacker activists. These guys do break the law, but they don't break the law for personal benefit. They're not trying to make money, or they might have a political motive. Anonymous, of course, is the best known example of hacktivist movements. But the lack of money making or trying to benefit personally makes them different from group number 3, which is criminals, organized online crime groups, trying to make money with botnets, with ransom trojans, with banking trojans, with keyloggers. And this group number 3, this is the biggest group by far. Vast majority of the attacks we see are coming from criminals. We receive on a typical day to our labs around 400,000 malware samples to be analyzed, which we collect automatically from all over the internet. We estimate that 98% of those 400,000 samples every day are coming from group number 3. That's how big it is. This is the biggest problem in numbers. But there's different kinds of ways of ranking seriousness, because group number 4 is governments. And of course, governmental attacks are much rarer. Much rarer, but when they hit you, they're much more serious. Because when criminals hit an organization, typically they weren't after that particular organization. They're after a victim. They don't really care who the victim is. So for example, credit card keyloggers, which are installed on corporate computers to collect credit cards as their numbers are being typed. The criminals don't care if the credit cards they collect are American credit cards or Canadian or Italian or Finnish. I mean, they just want credit cards. That's what they want. So these are very democratic attacks. They target everybody. But of course, the governmental attacks don't just target everybody. Not everybody becomes a target for a government. Many companies are worried about governmental attacks because these make the headlines. And these guys have the capabilities, the resources. They have the money. They have the 0 days. They have the skills. So these are scary problems. But organizations which were not being targeted by governmental attacks, for example, governmental espionage before the internet, didn't suddenly become a target just because of the internet. Very few organizations are being targeted. But of course, there are organizations which are being targeted. And then we have the last group, which is extremists or terrorists. And this is a problem which is still in the future. We have not seen cyber terrorism. Yes, we have seen terror groups which operate online. We see groups which recruit online, which communicate online, including communicate with encryption. But this is not really what we would call cyber terrorism, is it? Because this is exactly the same use of the internet as any other organization does for internet. Like every company recruits on the internet, every company communicates on the internet. So do these guys. But it's quite clear that especially Islamic State would like to be able to do more. They would like to be able to do cyber terrorism, or they would like to be able to support their real world attacks with online components to expand their attacks to new domain, that is the cyber domain. And I did a fairly large study into the online capabilities of terrorist groups 5 years ago. I spoke about this at the RSA conference in San Francisco. And 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, the end result of my study was that while I was able to find examples of extremist groups which were using the internet, we didn't really have a problem at the time. And I did end my research with the statement saying that this, unfortunately, this problem is only going to get worse, not better. And that's exactly what has been happening over the last 5 years, especially with Islamic State. Islamic State is recruiting their expertise from the West. Many of their hacker skills are coming from different European countries. And the thing that seems to be limiting their capability to act right now seems to be US Army, which has so far launched 2 targeted drone strikes to kill hackers. And just saying that statement out loud sounds like something out of a science fiction book, doesn't it? US Army has launched drone strikes to kill hackers. True story, has happened twice now. Both of those Islamic State hackers who were killed in Syria in targeted strikes were UK citizens recruited by Islamic State from UK to move to Syria. And I spoke about one of those guys because we did a case study on one of those Islamic State hackers. He was one of the leaders at the time, because I was following this guy before he joined Islamic State, when he was still stationed in United Kingdom, where he was more like the guy here in group number 2. He was more like a hacktivist guy. At some stage, he started becoming radicalized. At some stage, he left UK and moved to Syria, changed his name, joined the Islamic State. And I did a case study on this guy and actually spoke about his career or his history in an event in Europe. And the interesting point about that thing was that that talk was videoed and posted to YouTube. And then the guy himself watched the video on YouTube. And then he started sending me messages, which is not nice when you know what these guys are capable of. But of course, this story does have a happy ending, which is that he's dead now, because he's one of the guys who was killed in those drone strikes. But Islamic State or other extremist groups is really worrying as source of cyber attacks, because when we look at these 5 groups, everyone else has a motive we can understand. Spies want to spy, criminals want to steal, hacktivists want to protest. So we can sort of forecast what kind of attacks they will be doing. But the attacks extremists and terrorists are making make no sense. The real world attacks make no sense. They're hard to understand. They're hard to forecast. For example, there's no other group here which would be, for example, interested in taking down the internet. Nobody wants to crash the internet. Criminals don't want to crash the internet. Why? Because they make their money on the internet. Hacktivists love the internet. Governments need the internet to do their attacks or to do espionage. The only party which really would like to kill the internet, if possible, would be extremists. So these guys are different from all the other ones. And we can hope that this problem is not going to become bigger than it already is. So these attacks done by criminals, they're all over the news. And they're very expensive. That's what we always hear. But how expensive? Like, how bad can it be? Well, there's a good example on just how expensive a cyber attack can become with the case of the Yahoo hack, which was in headlines 2 months ago. Because Yahoo lost over 1 to 2 billion user accounts and passwords from their systems. And what made this interesting was that this was in the middle of the acquisition process as they were being bought by Verizon. So Yahoo had to drop their price tag by $350 million. $350 million only because they were hacked. That's how much it can cost at an extreme. Which then creates the next question. Whose fault is this? Who did this to Yahoo? And the answer is this guy. It is Karim Baratov, a Russian citizen living in Toronto, actually right now in jail in Toronto, waiting extradition to the United States to be tried for hacking into Yahoo together with his partner in crime, Alexei, another Russian, who is in Russia at the moment. And don't get me wrong, not all the hackers are Russians, because some of them are from Ukraine. That is a joke. So Karim, one thing that we do when we investigate cases involving online organized crime groups is to try to find the online footprint of these people. And today, everybody is on Facebook. Even the criminals are on Facebook. So we're quite often able to find social media profiles of these online criminals. They might be having their profiles under different names or things like that, but they are online. And looking at their social media profile paints a picture. So for example, this is from Karim's Instagram. That's a picture of his car keys. 2 Mercedes, 1 Lambo, 1 Ferrari, and 1 Maserati. And here's a picture from his yard. That is a Rolls Royce. And they always say that crime doesn't pay. Here it does. But of course, like I just told you, he is no longer enjoying his car collection because he is in jail at the moment. So the amount of money moving in online crime is significant, and we see this easily when we follow the online movements of cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin provide online criminals with anonymous money transfers, just like cash in the real world is the preferred way of moving money. For real world criminals, Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies is the preferred way of moving money for online criminals. It also enabled trends like ransom attacks. This is a ransom Trojan. We're all familiar with this problem of an employee walking into our office Monday morning carrying his laptop to the office. Unfortunately, the laptop got infected at a airline lounge on Sunday. So the employee carries in a ransom Trojan, which then overnight will encrypt not only his laptop, but all the shares in the network drive that user can access. After which the Trojan demands a ransom payment if you want to get your own files back. And the ransom is always demanded in Bitcoin or in other cryptocurrencies, which of course doesn't mean that Bitcoin is bad, because it isn't bad, just like cash isn't bad. And I always travel with one Bitcoin. So if you've never seen a Bitcoin, a physical Bitcoin, I have one here. Let me put this around. Bitcoin's valuation, or the exchange rate to dollar today, is around $1,200. So I want to get that back afterwards. Right now I'm showing trust to you, right? Or actually it's for sale. If you want to buy it, it's for sale. Nevertheless, the mechanisms that online criminals use to make money online are very creative. I mean, the idea of taking people's own files as a hostage is fairly creative. I mean, the original idea on how many hackers make money is that they steal information and sell that information to the highest bidder. But when you steal information from, let's say, a home user, there's nothing worth selling. It's somebody's holiday photos and his email history. Nobody wants to buy that, except the user himself. That's the operating logic of ransom Trojans. They steal the information and sell it to the highest bidder. In this case, the highest bidder is the computer's owner himself. And if you actually go through and pay the ransom, they will deliver what they promised. You will get your files back. This has been tested many times by many unfortunate victims who did not have backups to recover from. Of course, we never recommend people to pay, but we know many do. And I suppose the most creative thing in ransom Trojans I've recently seen was in a Trojan we found in January, a ransom Trojan called Popcorn, which encrypts your files, wants 1 Bitcoin, so $1,200 to get your files back. However, if you don't have $1,200, let's say you're some home user and you just can't afford to pay $1,200 to get your files back, it will offer to give you your files back for free. It will give you your files back for free if you infect 2 of your friends. And this is a brilliant mechanism, isn't it? It's very creative. It's hard to be angry at these guys when they are so creative, because they are combining a pyramid scam with a ransom Trojan, or creating some kind of a chain letter effect into a ransom Trojan. But I suppose the most important developments over the last years have been with governmental action. I don't really like the word cyber war. And the reason why I don't really like it is that it's way overused. Because every time there's anything happening anywhere in the world which is somehow linked to any government, the headlines will speak about cyber war. First of all, I don't believe in cyber war as a separate phenomenon. Cyber is a domain. It's yet another domain. Thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, we were already fighting wars with very primitive weapons, with our swords and our horses. And in the early days, we were only able to fight wars on land. We only had land war, because we weren't capable of fighting wars on the sea. But eventually we got the capability to fight wars on land and sea. And when the wars expanded to sea war, land war didn't go away. Then we had both land war and sea war. Typically, conflicts would involve both. And then we got planes. We got a new domain, air war. Then we got satellites and stuff, space war, and now cyberspace war. But no war is going to remove or leave old domains. They only expand to new domains. And cyber war is also a bad term for most attacks, because most attacks are not about waging war. Most governmental attacks are about stealing information. Most of the attacks that we analyze are about espionage. And espionage isn't war. Espionage is espionage. Spying is spying. War is war. And words matter. If something isn't war, it shouldn't be called a war. Because we will be needing this word for real examples of cyber war. Real cyber war, if you will. So why are governments so eager to do offensive attacks in the online world? Because cyber weapons are effective, affordable, and deniable. Effective, affordable, deniable. That's a great combination. That's a great combination in any weapon. And here we have a weapon which combines these features. So it's no wonder we are in a new arms race. And by the way, I believe that one of the things which is accelerating this arms race right now is, a little bit surprisingly, the leaks from Mr. Snowden. I don't think he realized this himself. And of course, he wasn't trying to accelerate the arms race. But what happened after his leaks is that many other governments were looking at the documents which were leaked. But holy hell, this is what the Americans are doing. We want to be doing this as well. Look at what they're doing. That's cool. We want to do that. We want to do that. And we are now in an accelerated arms race. One thing I'd really like to see would be Snowden's from Russia and China and from other superpowers. Where are they? So if deniability is one of the key properties of cyber weapons, how can we do attribution? Attribution was already referred to here earlier, that it is possible to do. It's hard, but it is possible to do. The very first governmental case that I worked with was in 2003, so 14 years ago. In that case, the victim was a European defense contractor, and after investigating the case for several weeks, we concluded that this is a governmental attack, and we believe it was launched from People's Liberation Army from China. That was 14 years ago. And during those years, we've investigated thousands and thousands of cases, governmental attacks from many, many different governments, including the Russians, including United States, including North Korea, including Iran. And there's much, much more out there. And I've coined a term for what I call the fog of cyber war. We've all heard of the term of fog of war. Well, there's also fog of cyber war. And it's a little bit different term, because in the real world, with traditional weapons, with many weapons, the power of the weapons is not in using them. The power of the weapons is in deterrence. Perfect example is nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have been used in a war 2 times. The whole rest of the power of nuclear weapons has been in deterrence. There are 11 countries on the planet which have nuclear weapons. We all know them. And when you know that a country has nuclear weapons, then you know not to mess with them because they have nuclear weapons. This is deterrence. But in cyber, we have no clue what are the capabilities of different countries. You can actually go and Google the amount of tanks Russia has, or the amount of aircraft carriers United States has, or the amount of warheads China has. You can get the exact count. But you will not be able to Google the cyber capabilities. And even though we know the biggest players, we know that USA is very good, we know Israel is very good, we know that China and Russia are very active. Beyond that, it becomes really, really cloudy, really, really quickly. So if the power of cyber weapons is not in deterrence, then the power of cyber weapons is in using them, so making it much more likely that they actually are being used. And one more thing which drives governments into using these weapons is that these weapons have a best before date or expiry date. They don't work forever because many of these weapons rely on exploits which target vulnerabilities in software like our operating systems or our browsers, our applications. And those vulnerabilities will not stay there forever because systems change. Operating systems are upgraded. Bugs are found and fixed. So if you want to get value for your investment into cyber weapons, you can't wait. You have to use them. And this is, of course, a varying development. And if this arms race is in the very beginning, it's going to take decades before we get into real discussions about cyber disarmament or rules of law for cyber war, if you will. Maybe it's going to take quite a while. We'll see. I know there's already initiatives in building these. And there are easy things we could imagine that would make sense as rules of law for cyber war or rules of law for cyber weapons. An easy example, Stuxnet. Stuxnet had a kill date. We found Stuxnet in June 2010. It had been spreading already for 3 years by that time. Stuxnet ended all operations in June 2012. This was pre-programmed in the code from the beginning. Why? Because the authors of Stuxnet did not want to leave it spreading around the world forever. They knew that the operation they were working with is going to be over by June 2012. So it was pre-programmed to stop all operations. And this is something that I believe we probably should be regulating into cyber weapons or cyber in the rules of law for cyber war. That, you know, when you use cyber weapons, you must not let them continue operations forever. I think everybody would agree, everywhere would agree that that would be a good idea. Things like that. There are things that could be done, fairly simple things. So almost all of the cases, thousands of cases that we've analyzed over the years, governmental cases, are either espionage or sabotage. Espionage or sabotage. And espionage is the vast majority. Sabotage cases are rare, like Stuxnet was sabotage, it wasn't espionage. And then there is one outlier, one governmental case that I can name which is not sabotage and which is not espionage, and that's the attack against the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, which is probably better known by the abbreviation SWIFT. Because the SWIFT attack was done by North Korea. And this attack was not about sabotage, it was not about espionage, it was about stealing money. And there are very few governments on this planet which are desperate enough to resort to stealing money from other governments. But this seems to be an example of that. Then again, North Korea has been printing fake US dollars for a decade already. So if you have a desperate government, it's no surprise they resort to things like this. And in the attacks against international banks which were using the SWIFT network for money transfers, the attackers actually tried stealing over 900, almost $1 billion. I went to Wikipedia to check what is the annual budget for the country of North Korea. Their annual budget is 4 billion. So $1 billion would be a quarter of their national budget. They succeeded in stealing around $90 million. Transactions actually failed or were stopped. So let's speak about attribution here. How can I say this is North Korea? Well, first of all, I'm not a government entity. I can say what I want. So I can say we believe this is North Korea. We believe beyond reasonable doubt. This is the case with almost every time we attribute a case to a Russian government or Chinese government. We are confident enough to say it out loud. We very rarely reach 100% certainty because deniability is one of the core principles. Out of those money transfers, majority of them, $72 million, was wired to this casino in Philippines, from where it was laundered and moved further. And the malware which was used to do the transfer encrypted the communication using this encryption key, this key right here. And when we saw this key in the code of the SWIFT Trojans, we realized that we had seen this key before. We had seen this key once before. We had seen it 2 years earlier. And this key had never been made public. So basically nobody knew the key except the original author of both of these Trojans. So there's a connection here between two different attacks. So what was the other attack from 2 years ago? Well, that was the Sony Pictures hack, where Sony Pictures was hacked by the government of North Korea because of the movie, The Interview, in which the dictator of North Korea is killed. Sorry for spoiling this to you if you haven't seen the movie, but he is killed in the movie. And when this happened, US government made a public statement immediately saying that this is North Korea. And many people, many experts were surprised. I was surprised by this statement. But how the hell do they know? Like, how can they be so sure? Because the deniability part is one of the core features of cyber attacks. 2 weeks later, New York Times had a breaking story in which they told the world how did the US government knew. They knew because US government had hacked the North Korean systems 2 years earlier, and they were watching the North Koreans do it. This is how you get 100% certainty, when you've actually in the systems and you're watching them do it, which of course changes the story from the North Koreans hacking a US Hollywood studio to a North Korea hacking Hollywood studio, and US government knows because they hacked North Korea. So an example of what I would call attack in cyber war would be the attack against Brukar Oblenergo, which is the largest electricity distribution company in Ukraine. And this is the power outage case, which has been in the news many times. But what makes this unique is that this attack, which came from Russia, which was hitting a critical infrastructure target in Ukraine, happened in the middle of a war. This actually is during a war, or at least a conflict. Of course, Russians don't call it a war, but when you go to another country's land and steal part of their land by force, I call it a war, okay? I think this is war. And in this particular case, the engineers operating the long-distance electricity grid of Ukraine lost control of the workstations that were controlling the backup power generators at the relays. And this happened on Christmas Eve 2015. And they lost control, and they were simply watching the attackers control their workstations and shut down power from 200,000 people. And in my book, this would be cyber war, because there was a war. And that makes it different from what we saw here during presidential elections, which was labeled as cyber war over and over again in different newspapers. Yes, Russia tried affecting the outcome of presidential elections in the biggest superpower on the planet. True story. That's not cyber war. That's not war. Because there's no war declared between Russia and the United States. Thank God there is no war. But it is a remarkable scenario. And when we look at the latest news from today, the same group that was behind one of the attacks against DNC has now been attributed as also targeting the systems of the French presidential candidate, Mr. Marconi. So let's hear it from the man himself. This is from an interview done by Bloomberg with President Putin in October, before US elections. During that interview, the Bloomberg journalist asks Putin the key question. Mr. Putin, who hacked the Democrats? And Putin answers, is that really important? Does it even matter who hacked it? The important thing is the content of the emails. There is no need to distract the public about who did it. There is no need to distract the public about who did it. Now, we've analyzed many Russian malware cases over the years. And frankly, I still remember the time when it used to be hackers who were causing havoc and who were releasing private information. Now it seems to be governments causing havoc and governments releasing private information. One thing we do when we analyze these cases is that when we are ready with our investigation, we publish our reports and we make them public, including the reports where we make the call that this is Russian government. Then when the report goes out, we watch with great interest how do these actors change their behavior. We put out a report about the group called Callisto 2 weeks ago. Last year, we put out a 70-page report on a group called Dukes. Both are linked to Russia. And it's very interesting to see when the report goes out, where most of the downloads of this report are coming from. A very big part of them are coming from Russia, from Russian IP addresses. And in our reports, we list their servers, their IP addresses, their infrastructure, their encryption keys, their malware hashes, and then we watch how are they going to change the operation, because now this is public. And in some cases, they haven't changed their operations at all. They continue operations as if nothing would have happened. They go back to the office next morning and continue attacks with the same malware, with the same servers, with the same encryption keys, which tells us that these guys are not worried about getting caught. These guys are not worried about the cops coming to their doors. Why? Because they are the government. Thank you very much.